Hello and welcome to the Overlanding podcast, a podcast dedicated to vehicle-dependent travel. I'm your host, Andy Smith, and throughout the series I'll be chatting with adventurous people who have chosen to travel the world by bicycle, motorcycle, car and truck. The aim of the podcast is to discover what motivates people to embark on life-changing journeys and to hear some incredible stories along the way. You can find us on iTunes and Stitcher by searching the Overlanding podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate and review our show on those platforms. Alternatively, you can visit our website, theoverlandingpodcast.com, where you can listen to all the previous episodes and find supporting information regarding each and every podcast. In this episode, I chat to Jason Hamasu from Oregon Trail Off-Road. Jason's inquisitive mind led to the inception of Oregon Trail Off-Road, which is a project where the group's goal was to retrace the historical Oregon Trail from the mid-1800s. Jason and his crew achieved their goal earlier this year on their 44-day expedition, which took them on a challenging journey through 6 states: Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, and finally Missouri. The trip took them through some incredibly challenging terrain, and it was quite enlightening and entertaining, as I was told during the podcast. So without further ado, let's get started and hear his story. So let's kick off with our usual question. Out of these 5 locations, where would you prefer this interview to take place? A, near a babbling brook in a lush green valley. B, in a little tent on a windy mountaintop. C, on a warm beach with the sea lapping at your feet. D, round a nighttime campfire in a forest. Or E, deep in a tropical jungle.
Oh, that's easy for me. D, around a campfire in a forest.
Okay,
for sure.
That's the most popular answer, actually. Typically,
is it really?
Yeah, everyone goes for it, and that's funny. You can understand why, though.
Yeah, it's the community, right?
Yeah,
around the fire.
Exactly. Okay, if you could just introduce yourself, please.
I am Jason from Oregon Trail Off-Road. Oregon Trail Off-Road is an expedition team set to retrace North America's historic trails. So this last trip that we just got back on this last summer was retrace the Oregon Trail, which for those of you not steeped in American history, that was one of the largest voluntary migrations in world history. It was basically, the pioneers back in the late 1830s to 1860s, right in there. They migrated from the east basically to west in hopes of a better life and better land and all that stuff. So we actually spent 44 days, and it was actually 7,000 miles in total retracing that trail there, and then turned around and came back on highways and stuff. But it was a pretty crazy adventure.
Cool. And why that particular trail? Does that one have any personal significance to you? Or?
You know what's funny? I'll tell you how the idea came up. And the Oregon Trail, obviously, we're from Oregon. And the city we live in is Oregon City, which was one of the main endpoints of the Oregon Trail. So at the time I was, I had a couple of buddies that were trying to kind of figure out an adventure, something to do. And, Moab, Utah is one of the kind of, premier off-road places here in the States. And so we're going to take a trip to Moab, and I'm a huge documentary fan. I always have been. And so I was like, well, I'm going to shoot some video. It's super amateur. I mean, I've never done it professionally, anything like that, but I was like, I'm going to shoot some video. Let's do a trip to Moab. And just by happenstance, I was sitting in my living room watching a TV show on it's like the Yukon Gold Rush, I think is what the program was about, but they were taking their gear up to the mining claim with the wagons, and it kind of reminded me of learning about the Oregon Trail. And being that we're from Oregon, it was a big thing learning, during school, growing up, learning about the Oregon Trail.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, being in school, it always loses its luster, right? You hear about it in school, and you could, as a kid, you could, pretty much care less about the Oregon Trail. But as you get older, it was one of those things where it didn't have necessarily that, super cool draw to me right at first. It was like, hey, this would be kind of a cool idea. And I bounced it off a few of my friends, and they're like, oh, no, that's a really good idea. And we started researching, and nobody had really done it before in the way that we had. And so we're like, well, let's try try to pursue it. But the funny thing is like growing up, it loses its luster. So you're like, oh yeah, the Oregon Trail, it's everywhere. There's museums everywhere and that kind of thing. But the more you dive into it, the more that like passion kind of stirs, and you're like, well, these are the kind of people that we are. We're modern day pioneers, so to speak. I mean, we're the travelers, we're the wanderers, we're the people exploring, and that's who these people were. So we kind of felt like we were in the same spirit as those pioneers 150 years ago. So it's kind of a natural progression. None of us planned on it. There wasn't any like particular significance other than being in Oregon and being in the city where it ended. But it was one of those things that it kind of snowballed, and as we started digging into it, the passion kind of started building up, and we kind of like fell in love with the Oregon Trail, and that kind of stemmed into there's hundreds of these old pioneer historic trails across the North America, and so I'm like, we could do this forever. So
well, that was something I picked up on actually when you were introduced yourself right at the very beginning. Just then you said we've recently just done this particular trail, with the hint that you were possibly going to do more, and that was initially going to be one of my questions towards the end of the conversation. So
we can touch. Yeah, we could. You want to touch on that now?
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah. So it's this kind of funny story how it all happened, and kind of in the same vein as how it kind of organically grew in the first place. We were actually on the expedition, and we're traveling through Wyoming. And we hit this. It's an old, restored historic town. It's called South Pass City, and we're talking to the people that run it. And it's there's probably 8-10 outbuildings that they've all restored, all in the old pioneer fashion. Has all this furniture and all that in it. So we walked through, and then they started telling us about this old outlaw town called Atlantic City. So we were actually meeting up with another buddy at the time. So we're like, well, why don't you meet us here at Atlantic City, and we'll check this old outlaw town out. So we head into this outlaw town, and it's got to be population like 30. I mean, it's a tiny population. And you pull in, and it just feels like an outlaw town. I mean, there's, anti-government rhetoric posted up, and it just kind of has that vibe of an outlaw, like you would think an outlaw town would be. So we roll in, and all that's there is, some houses, some buildings, and then, one kind of bar / mercantile / like restaurant. So we roll in there and we sit down, and it's classic Western fashion, like, city slickers coming into a small town, right? We walk in, and there's, maybe 1 or 2 locals in there, and the bartender, and they all kind of turn around and look at us, and they're like, what are these guys doing here? And kind of turn a cold shoulder, and we start telling them what we're doing and why we're there, and they start opening up to us a little bit, and they're like, a few years ago Robert Redford came through here, and he was doing the Outlaw Trail. And we're like, the Outlaw Trail? What is the Outlaw Trail? Like, never heard of it. I mean, we're in the historic kind of trail realm, and I've never really heard of this Outlaw Trail. And turns out it's basically, I mean, it's not really an established trail, but it was basically the path that, like, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Oops. Sorry. Anyways, so sorry, I lost my train of thought. So Robert Redford basically on horseback came through and retraced this on horseback, and it was the path that the outlaws kind of avoided law, and they had to have these places because they were, they stole cattle, right? So they had to have these areas where they could keep this cattle, and these are these like super remote areas in Utah, New Mexico. It basically goes from the Mexico border pretty much up to Canada, and it's this trail that they kind of followed through. And so, they're talking to us about it. Well, I mean, turns out a few years ago was I think it was the early 80s when he was through there. And so we started. And
what was he doing? Was he making a documentary, or did he just have an interest in this?
Right. So he was basically, it was him, a couple of photographers, and a small team, and they went and they just did it. It was funded by National Geographic.
So like a journal report. Okay. Yeah.
Right. So he did like a little National Geographic article, and then he wrote this book called The Outlaw Trail: A Journey Through Time. And it's a very easy read. It's more pictures than anything, but it kind of goes over the spots that he went to. And so, we're kind of, I mean, we're not the clean cut, we're a little rough around the edges, I would say, our team is. most of us are tradesmen, so we work, in construction and stuff like that. And, the Outlaw Trail just kind of like piqued this vein that like spoke to us, I guess, because in one way or another we kind of view ourselves as outlaws. And so it was like, man, what is this Outlaw Trail? And so that's how it happened. It was just random at this mercantile in the middle of Wyoming in a small town, but that's how the idea stemmed. And so that's going to be the next expedition. So we're shooting for 2018. Right now. Hopefully we could do it sooner, but that we're kind of giving ourselves some time because we're all self-financed and whatnot. So gotta save up for it. But that's the plan. Is the Outlaw Trail is the next one.
Okay, that sounds cool. And some of the things you just talked about then. Initially, when you contacted me, I had. Not doubts, but I was questioning whether you guys would be the correct people to interview for the podcast, because primarily most of the people we've spoken to generally have been Europeans who've done really long world trips, like 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years,
right?
And a couple of people like lifetimes. It's just crazy. And I was thinking maybe that's our audience, and then you approached me, and I was thinking, these guys, they've remained in their own country, and they, it's 44 days. It was quite short. It was 44 days, right? I got that right. Yeah. It's quite a short trip in comparison to some of the other people I've spoken to, and I just wasn't sure whether it was correct for the podcast.
Sure.
And then when I dived into it and did a bit more research, I was like, yeah, this is totally perfect for the podcast. And what's really interesting, what you're talking about there, is the reaction from the locals when you turn up in a little town, and it's in your own country, which is pretty amazing. Like it's really similar. I can relate to those kind of things happening as a foreigner turning up in a country in the Middle East, and you walk in and you're completely alien to them, and everyone stops and looks and thinks, who are these guys? But for me, that's what's interesting about it is that the US is so massive. And you have such wilderness areas literally on your doorstep that it's very easy for you to go on a trip like this, and it be equally just as much of an adventure as someone who's driving, halfway around the world.
Absolutely.
If not more so, because of due to the fact that some of the areas are wilderness areas, and then coupled with that the historic nature of your trip and retracing the Oregon Trail, for me, just I think a lot of the time we talk to other overlanders, and they don't really consider what they're doing an expedition. And what I really liked about your trip was it had a purpose, it had a goal, and a lot of the time people are just traveling for the sake of traveling.
Right.
A lot of the people we speak to who they just enjoy traveling and soaking up other cultures basically in other countries. But what I really loved about this was that you had a goal and a purpose. I'm just aware that quite a lot of our listeners are probably going to be in Europe, and I just want to confirm a couple of things so that everyone knows the history of the trail. It was originally laid out in the mid 1800s, right?
So the trail was established in, I think, the early 1930s, and it ran until 1830s until 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was built, and that basically shut down the Oregon Trail because now they had a railroad that went east to west. So it was the original trail was about 2,500 miles in total. I think there was probably between, I've seen different estimates, but between 200 and 300,000 people that came over on that trail. It was actually 4 different trails. They call it the Immigrant Trail from, east where they left off to pretty close to the western part of the states. And then it split off, and it did, there was an Oregon Trail that came to Oregon. There was a California Trail, and that was the California Gold Rush down there. They had a huge gold rush, and so that was that trail. They had the Mormon Trail, which were the Mormons that broke down and went into Utah. And then you had the Pony Express, which was basically the mail back then. Okay. And so it's all generally the same trail until you get to Idaho, and that's when it all branches off. But yeah, it was. Generally about 2,500 miles in total. Okay. So.
And so you were driving it in reverse, so you start in Oregon, then it goes through Idaho, right? And then
yeah, so we're
Wyoming.
Oregon. Yep. Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, and it ends in Missouri. And
Okay.
Kansas City is basically the border city. It's a river city, and one half is Missouri and the other half is Kansas. So
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't really. I mean, we actually did go into Missouri, but the Oregon Trail kind of just started right on that border.
Yeah. And then what I really found fascinating when I did a bit more research as well it's just the fact that no one had actually really tied the whole trail together again really since, had they? There are sections which are mapped out.
Yeah. Well, and that was the hardest part for us is it's twofold, right? I mean, you don't want to be trampling on history, and you don't want to be taking these big trucks over like history if there's wagon rest there. And then the other thing is, like you said, throughout history, that stuff is lost to roads. I mean, you think, that if they took the path of least resistance, then, most likely it's going to be paved. And a lot of the original trail is paved.
Yeah.
A lot of it's private property, so you can't go on it. And so it was a super, I mean, it took me probably over a year, but it was just a painstaking process of plotting a route that stayed off-road and kind of followed the trail as closely as we could.
Yeah.
And not being on pavement as much as possible.
Yeah. And then how did you go about doing that? Were you actually getting feedback from people who were living in the areas? Because it's a big distance to cover, and if it's not mapped, how were you doing that?
So it was really hard because, I mean, we tried to do that originally as partner with people, but it just gets to be hard to coordinate everything, and then for them to give the feedback and trying to, make that workflow work, it was super hard. And so what I did is it's just a Google Earth based program, and I always tell people I essentially walked this whole route, because when you're creating this program, it's a map program, and you're dragging a line over a satellite image basically.
Yeah.
And you're zoomed in to the point where, you need to be able to see it. Sometimes it's not a road, right? It's just a 2-track that you can see from the satellite image. And so you're basically close enough zoomed in that you're a foot at a time kind of dragging a line through these areas. And you don't know. I mean, that's the thing. That's, that was part of the adventure too, is you don't even know if this road exists anymore. You don't know if it's private property. You don't know. I mean, you do as much research as you can, but you don't know until you get there. And oftentimes we ran into a locked gate or ran into private property, and you have to reroute yourself. Sometimes we inadvertently ended up on private property, had no idea. People are like, do you know you're on private property? No, we did not, but show us the quickest way out of here, and we'll get off your property.
So, yeah. So primarily you personally did that most of the research, because there was 8 people in the team, is that correct?
Yeah, there's about 7 people on the team. There's 4 people on the actually expedition team. So the 4 guys, they're me, Kobe, and me and Kobe are the 2 founders. And then Wilkie, who's our videographer, Chris, who's our mechanic, and then we've got Zach, JP, and Jesse, and they're all like behind the scenes. So they came for a few weeks on the expedition and then broke off. They just couldn't take the time off. But I mean, trying to plan something like this takes a whole team of people. It's just, I mean, it's crazy the amount of, when you're talking about history and digging into that, and, we're doing the documentary series as well, trying to, show what we're doing and show this old history of the trail and bring that kind of back to life. And so it's a big undertaking. So it takes a lot of people.
Yeah.
But yeah, the expedition team is just the 4 guys, but, the team in itself, 7 people, it kind of makes the wheels turn.
Yeah. And, so there's 4 of you and traveling in 2 trucks, right?
Right. So we have an 80 series Land Cruiser. It's 93, which is kind of a typical Overlander vehicle, and then we have a Ford Ranger, American Ford Ranger, which is nothing like you guys have abroad. So it's kind of it's almost laughed at, to be honest, but. That's kind of the premise of who we are. We're 2 regular guys. Like I told you before, we're construction workers. So, I mean, we're 2 regular guys working with what we got, and that's kind of what we did. And that was we took our trucks, we built them the best we could, and it made it, they both came out, in flying colors. We didn't really, I mean, there's little hiccups along the way, but none of them had any, catastrophic breakdowns or anything like that.
Yeah. So the majority of the driving then, if it was traditionally like a wagon trail, and I bet originally some of it would have been single track kind of horse trail when it would have been originally. So I'm presuming that the terrain was pretty rough then.
So here's the crazy thing: is like you would think so, and yeah, it's rough. I mean, you're on dirt roads and kind of rough roads, but if you think about the pioneers, they're coming over in these big wagons, right? So they're taking the path of least resistance. And so the terrain that you're going through, yeah, it's it's rocky, it's rough, but it's not anything like, it's nothing crazy. You're not crawling up, huge mountains or anything. The terrain is relatively flat. It's just you're doing lots and lots of like super bumpy miles,
Yeah. So what was your kind of average mileage a day? How much were you?
We shot for 150 to 160 miles a day. It varied, right? So if you're not familiar with kind of the terrain of U.S., you have the Rocky Mountain Range, which is basically kind of goes from Idaho into Wyoming.
Yeah.
And then you have the Cascade Mountain Range, which is in Oregon. So you have these two big, mountain ranges that you have to cross. And then you hit the plain states. So the mountain, states were the ones that we spent the most time in because that was the hardest terrain because you're going through all these things and stuff. And then you hit the plain states.
In Nebraska, right?
It was like we blew through. We could have blown through Nebraska in like a day and a half, and it was like we, decided to take our time and see some historical sites and whatnot. But it was like, some of our days were 25, 30, 50 miles, and some of the days were 200-300 miles.
Yeah.
So it was just one of those things where, we gave ourselves 44 days, and the crazy thing is we did a 10-day expedition before going through Oregon, and it took us 7 days to get through Oregon. We basically had 10 days. We were going to spend 10 days in Idaho, and we had like a crazy breakdown on top of a hill. And so it turned us around, but we were like, okay, based on our last trip, it's going to take kind of 7 days a state-ish, depending on how big the state is. On this trip, we blew through, and so we were pretty much ahead of schedule the whole time. And we actually got to Missouri 8 days early, and we had actually taken a 3-day detour down to Colorado too earlier on in the trip. So we were way ahead of schedule, not knowing, right? You want to give yourself as much time as possible. And based on the trips that we did, that was kind of like what we thought it would take. But it was, once you hit those plain states, it's, they say there's nothing there but corn and soy, and they're right. That's all that's out there.
Plain sailing, as they say.
Yep. Yeah. Yep.
Cool. Okay, and this particular expedition then, is this the first major trip that you've undertaken? What's the longest trip prior to this one that you've done?
That 10-day trip. I mean, we were. I mean, it's the crazy thing about us is like overlanding in the States is generally kind of a new thing, new fad that's coming out or whatever, But there's a lot of people that have done overlanding here in the States forever. Exactly, right. So when we started doing this, Chris, for instance, he's the mechanic and he's also a military survival trainer too. So we have him start our fires and do all that stuff. But me and him started, traveling together and doing this kind of travel where, we were just exploring our local area, right? We'd spend 3 or 4 days, but we were never kind of staying in one spot. We'd try to travel and go explore these areas. And, and then one day somebody is like, hey, do you know they have a name for this? It's called overlanding. And we're like, oh, whoa. And then we look at it and we're like, oh, look at all this gear, like all this crazy stuff that we're trying to make ourselves. People have already made it. We could just buy it. So it was one of those things where the whole thing was kind of organic. Like we didn't know what overlanding was when we did this. We didn't know like anything about planning an expedition when we did this. I mean, the biggest trip we took before we actually left for this 44-day trip was a 10-day, right? And it was like, it was, I always tell everybody, they say, how was the trip? And I said, it was everything that I could have expected and nothing I planned for. I mean, that's the way the trip went. It was you spend 2.5 years planning for something like this, and then when you actually get out there, and a lot of it will be probably obvious to, a lot of the people that travel, and that's their lifestyle. It's, that overland style travel. But when you get out there, there's just practical things that, like we had our camp kitchen in a box. And if you dig your camp kitchen out of a box for 44 days, by the 44th day, you just want to chuck that thing out the road and keep on going.
Yeah.
So it's, there's little things that you don't take into consideration. You're like, oh, we'll be fine. 4 dudes, some of us are military. It was just like one of those things where it's like, we'll breath through it, But when you're 2 feet away from 4 guys for 44 days, it's, there's nothing that can wear on your attitude more than that.
Oh man, you want to sit in your car with your wife next to you for 2 years.
Right, yeah. I can only imagine.
I'm only joking. She better not hear that. Yeah, well, that's interesting. So you were literally wild camping every night. Were you sleeping in the vehicles? Do you have roof tents? Or are you sleeping in ground tents? Roof tents, yeah. Yeah,
roof tents. So yeah, every day. I mean, and we had the what they call it a 3-person. It's more of a maybe a 2-person. So, and that was the thing that we were always laughing about. Is like, man, you're shoulder to shoulder with these guys driving all day long, and you're shoulder to shoulder sleeping with them all night long. It's like, I spend more time with you than I ever have with my wife.
Yeah. So that kind of dynamic with that much testosterone flying around, 4 guys, was it?
It was crazy.
Was it ever stressful, or was it just a full-on guy fest where you just had like, yeah, we're real men now, we're out in the wild?
No, it was every bit amount of drama as you could have with 4 women. It was just, I mean, it's different, right? It's 4 dudes, and you're a little bit more rough around the edges, so that's the way it comes out, you know? It's like, you know, I mean, Wilkie and Steve Wilkie and then Chris Flam, they're both ex-military. So, I mean, they're used to being in kind of like that kind of situation. However, being like living on top of each other is a little bit different. But, you know, so, yeah, there was definitely times where in the morning, you know, you're pissed off at somebody. And there's, you know, I'm a pretty mellow guy. I don't, you know, my boiling point is pretty high. But, you know, you spend 44 days and you're dealing with attitudes, and you're dealing with your own attitude as well. I mean, there was times where I just went off, you know, I mean, respectfully, but I raised my voice and I was yelling at the guys, and, you know, to a point where I had to come back later and be like, dude, I'm sorry, I kind of flipped out, you know, it was a great way to handle things, you know. But it's hard because, you know, when you're with 4 guys for that long, there's kind of like this dynamic that happens. And then, well, for instance, like we had 5 guys for the first 3 weeks, and then Zach left. And there's this weird like shifting when somebody leaves. So there's like this rebalancing that happens in a group dynamic that when somebody leaves. And then the same thing happens when somebody kind of like, everybody has their moments, right? Everybody has their days where they kind of lose it and they have to go by themselves and kind of do their own thing. And every time that happens, it's like this like adjusting. And it's just a weird, it's something that you can't plan for, and it's almost something you can't really explain until you've been in a situation where you've spent a lot of time in close quarters with the same people, you know? And it's like, it does 2 things. It makes you hate each other, but it builds a bond too that's like stronger than many of the friendships I've ever had in my life. And it's weird because, like, you know, like for Chris, for instance, like I've known him for a long time and we've been friends for a long time, but I've never spent that much time with him. And it's almost like, well, we always call it a brotherhood. You build this brotherhood between these guys, and it becomes like, and that's the funny thing. It was, the trip was, for us, was about retracing history, but it very much became about like this brotherhood and trying to like figure out how this family unit kind of works, doing what we're doing and trying to accomplish our goal.
Yeah.
And so it was, you know, it was, we didn't plan for any of that. You know, it was, thought we were just going to go retrace history and see some cool, you know, historical sites. And then it became this whole thing of, you know.
Well, I think it's interesting that dynamic. It's always something I try and bring up when I talk to people, especially if they're traveling with partners. A lot of the people I speak to are generally traveling as a husband and wife or family quite often. So it's interesting talking about those dynamics, because there aren't many other situations where you get, you know, unless you're an astronaut or you know, you're on a submarine or something, where you are in such a confined space. Admittedly, you're in the middle of all this wilderness and surrounded by space, but everything, it's almost like an extreme focus on the relationships, because you are having to be part of a team. And that's what's interesting. So I presume each one of the guys in your team all brought different skills to the table, which then ultimately made you achieve your end games, your goal. So.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's how we. Well, the crazy thing is we're all friends, right? But we all kind of, like you said, bring a different skill set. I mean, like, you know, Wilkie's our videographer, and he does, you know, most of our. We all kind of pitch into for the video, but he does, you know, majority of the video. And then, you know, Kobe, he's just our. I mean, it's fun. He's gonna hate me for saying this, but Kobe's one of those guys where it's like, I didn't realize the value of him personally, because he's one of those dudes that's like, I mean, he knows how to work on trucks now. He didn't when we first started getting into this. There's a lot of things that he was new to. So him personally, like, didn't necessarily bring like one main skill that, like, you know, contributed to the team. But I didn't really realize his value until we went on this expedition. And he's one of those guys where it's like, it doesn't matter what's going on in life or what's going on situationally. He's always even keeled, and his personality is the same. And for a group, especially a small group, to have that one guy is almost more valuable than having anybody else there, because it kind of holds the group to, there's there's some balance to it, I guess, and it keeps everybody from, because you get 4 Type A guys sitting around on an expedition, and things could get pretty gnarly, with people's, attitudes and opinions and stuff, and to have that one guy that kind of like balances everything out was invaluable. So I do navigation. Kobe's, he cooks and he drives and holds us all together, and then, like I said, Chris is our mechanic, and then we've got Jesse who helps on the back end of the video production stuff. JP, he helps with the planning, and then Zach, he does a lot of our like recovery stuff, and he helps us with the coordination of the vehicles and doing all that stuff.
Yeah.
So.
For the like you mentioned before, so there's numerous guys in the team, but and they came along for some of the trip. I presume you mentioned it very briefly earlier that they had work commitments. And that's one of the other reasons why I wanted to talk to you guys, was because, it's all very well talking to people who are doing 2 or 3 year trips all the time, but not everyone has that luxury of being able to take that much time off work. They have commitments, work commitments,
sure.
Life commitments. And you have family and stuff as well, right? Some of the guys have got kids, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got 1 kid and 1 on the way, and then Kobe has 3 kids.
Yeah.
The ironic thing is we all kind of work together. I'm a general contractor, and so Kobe and Wilkie work for me, and Chris kind of does his own thing, but he works with us sometimes too. So that was part of the reason why it was easier to take the time off. But I mean, part of the thing was too is we spent 2.5 years planning, so it wasn't something where we hopped off and decided we're gonna quit our jobs and go do this. It was there's a lot of planning that went into it. Because like you said, I mean, I would and I'm still trying to convince my wife to take our 2 kids and go travel for a living, but. I mean, we don't always have that luxury to do that right now, but this is, for us, this is our way of chasing that adventure in our own way. I mean, granted, like you said, it's not a 3 or 4 year, traveling experience, but in our own way, we try to fit as much, exploration and, the history side, like you said, that's, big for us. We love that.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think certainly the route you took, probably had more adventurous driving in 44 days than a lot of people do in their 2-year trips, to be honest.
Yeah, and it was crazy. I downplay it because I say it's a path of least resistance, but there's definitely some areas where we push those trucks to the limit.
I watched a few of the videos, so I was looking at the terrain, thinking, that's 44 days of that is going to be relatively hard work.
And the crazy thing is the toll it takes of just being on a dirt road and just shaking for all day long. It's just that vibration. 8 hours, 10 hours a day, that vibration just after a while drives you mad.
Oh man, and I tell you what, I have lost so many nuts and bolts out of my car from those vibrations. They just you check something and you're like, where is that gone? Yeah, it really takes its toll. And another thing that I thought was just quite amusing just then, just to step back a little bit to something you said. You guys work together. For quite a lot of the time. And I tell you what, big corporations pay a lot of money for team building exercises like the one you've done.
That is definitely the team building exercise where you'll come out on the other side working as a well-oiled unit. I'll tell you that.
Exactly. So just to go back to the film, what's the end game with the film? Is it to basically get the story out there, and what story, or is the aim of it to get some to kind of monetize the trip and get some kind of income coming back? What was the whole idea about doing the film?
If anybody wants to give us income, that'd be awesome. The videos for us is just. I'm a documentary fan, and that's like, I mean, I've never had anything interesting enough in my life to ever document, but I was always like, I did a little bit of video production in high school and stuff, nothing major or anything, but I've always just been a big fan, and I'm like, well, if I could do something interesting enough to like do a documentary on it, I'd take advantage of it, and then this thing kind of happened, and so it was just one of those things for us, it's just a way to document and get our story out there, it's been one of those things where it's, I feel like in the States, it's a little bit different than traveling abroad. We don't really have that, like, I feel like everybody's like 9 to 5. You got to have your job. You got to have, and so people don't, I guess, don't explore as much. And it's sad because, our backyard is like miles and miles of like public land. So, I mean, you can just go explore, go out into the forest, and it's like, one of the big things that we've gotten from this is inspiring other people to go out and explore. It's like, oh yeah, I live in that same area, and I could go, 20 minutes out into the forest to see this kind of same stuff, And so that was one of the hidden kind of cool things that happened, and people started coming out of the woodwork being like, I have this old, international scout that I've been trying to restore, and you guys kind of, re-sparked my, inspiration to restore it and get out and explore. And it's kind of one of those things. We didn't have any particular goal in mind. It was just, I like documentaries. I wanted to document something. I wanted something that I could leave behind for my kids. And, if other people like watching it, awesome. But, for me, I like making stuff that I like watching. So it's just one of those things. I don't think we had any particular goal in mind for it. It was just a way to entertain ourselves and entertain our family and people that are interested,
Yeah. I think it's, well, I think historically, I think that particular trip has historical value purely because of the nature of the trail that you've driven. I think making people aware of that is something that has a lot of value. And
I touched on that before too. It was like I said, it loses its luster, right? I mean, history, that's the bad part of history too, is like when you're learning about it in school, you don't really care about it then. And then when you're old enough to care, it's like, oh wow, look at all this stuff, and like a lot of the history to the Oregon Trail is kind of lost, especially in our generation. Nobody really has any interest in it, but everybody has interest in adventure and exploration and, that kind of pioneering spirit, if you will, but they're not into this. And it's like, you realize that this is what they did. These people took their families, and just like we do in modern days in our modern day wagons, so to speak, it's like some people just go and they travel and they just, in hopes of something better and seeing something cool, they go and, explore. And it's like, that's what these pioneers did. And that's kind of like what spoke to us about it when, at first it was just, hey, that's a cool idea. Let's, retrace the Oregon Trail. And then the more, like I said, the more we got into it, the more it was like, these people are our people, just 100 years ago.
So that's quite interesting because to a certain degree there was some kind of enlightenment which I guess brought new context to your own life. I guess it you have a new understanding of your roots and your history to some degree, I guess.
Absolutely.
And I think that's and probably a certain level of open-mindedness has probably come through that to some degree as well. I think when you travel in this way and you experience, even though even just going to like a little town in the middle of nowhere, that if you've never been to that little town, if you've all grown up in the city and then you visit that little town in the middle of nowhere, it gives you a whole new understanding of how people live in your own country, I guess. Yeah,
and you touched on that earlier, and that was the crazy thing for me is like I said, our 10-day expedition was the longest trip we've taken before then, and I've visited places in the States, but it's a different kind of travel when you're traveling by vehicle. If you're visiting Disney World or whatever, going to these different places, you typically only see a small chunk of it, and you're in a city usually, and you're not really seeing the local people, I guess. And the crazy thing is when you're visiting these places, you're like, I'm listening to people like farmers talk about farming, and it's just two locals that were sitting there talking, going back and forth, and the banter was almost like a different language. I'm sitting there just like enamored, listening to them talk about farming, having no idea what they're talking about, just sitting there listening to these two country boys talk about farming. And it's like, this is so it's surreal to be, this is my country, but I'm sitting here and I feel like I'm in a different country. I feel like I'm a guest in their country. It's what I feel like. And you're like, and that was one of my favorite things to do, is just listen to locals talk about local things. One of the crazy things that happened is, I told you we finished the expedition 8 days early. So we decided to go 6 hours south and hit the Ozark National Forest, which is in Arkansas. And it was one of those things where I've heard about it a few times, and we went and checked it out. And the local people were like, what you would think, like podunk, backcountry, kind of foresty people, but the nicest people in the world. And when you listen to them talk, it's like, I can't even understand what you're saying. This is so fascinating. But it's an interesting thing to be in your own country and start understanding like how vast it is, and just like how many like different kinds of terrain are in one small area,
Yeah. And I think certainly traveling overland is certainly the best way to see every country. It's
Absolutely.
like I say it, and I'm just repeating myself because I've said it to anyone who will listen. You feel every bump. You experience sights, smells, the dust, the dirt, everything. You really absorb yourself in that particular country.
Yeah.
That's cool. So when you got back, how did you find kind of reintegrating back to normal life after these 44 days? Because
I'd like to be back on the road if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm asking.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy because that 10-day trip we took, by the time I got back, I didn't want to go back out. We've got a local group here that explores locally pretty much every weekend, and it was like probably 2 months before I got back out and started exploring again.
Yeah.
This trip, it was like I left, I came back, and I was like, oh, I'm so glad to be home for like the first 3 days, and then I was like, oh man, it's just something different when you're like the overland travel. From the time you get up to the time you go to bed, you're doing something. Especially the way we did it, right? Because we're moving from place to place every day, so it's like when you get up in the morning, you're breaking down camp, you're driving all day. When you get to camp, you're setting up, you're cooking, you're eating, you're going to bed. So when you get home and there's not as much stuff to do, it's just kind of like, okay, now what do I do with my time?
And a lot of people I've spoken to in the US have never traveled outside their own country. Have you traveled outside of the US before?
Yeah, not far. I've been up to Canada and down to Mexico.
Yeah.
And that's about it. It's definitely something I'd like to do. It's just, eventually I'd like to travel abroad with Oregon Trail and do some stuff down in, South America or, down there. But, for now, I feel like we kind of have a lot of stuff that we want to accomplish here in the States before we start going abroad. Yeah. It was one of those things where if it was just for the sake of traveling, I'd probably be abroad a lot sooner. But just because of the path that we're on and tracing all this like historical stuff, like I just feel like I want to accomplish a lot of that before I start exploring abroad, I guess.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because your trip has such an important meaning, and it's very focused, and I like that. I think there's a lot of worth in that. I think certainly what you guys are doing, is really quite valuable because, firstly, it's a lot of fun for you guys to do,
right.
which is really important. If it wasn't fun, you wouldn't be doing it.
Exactly.
But secondly, the historical importance, which is something we touched on earlier. Originally, when I was doing some research and I was looking on your website, there was a statement which I guess you probably put up on when you first built the website, and it was like, our mission is to inspire other people into the great outdoors. It was something along those lines. I can't remember if that was correct.
Yeah.
But I really like that because certainly in Europe, I don't know if it would be the same in the US because you have such wide expanses of national parks and kind of wilderness areas. But certainly in Europe, young people have generally lost that connection with nature. And certainly, definitely in the US, I think there's a lot more hiking going on and things like that. Right. I think people do take advantage of the national parks. But anything that gets people out into kind of wilderness and the great outdoors and living outside, I think has a lot of worth. And then on top of that, you've got the whole historical importance as well to what you're doing. So I think what you do has a lot of value, and I think it's really cool.
Our mission statement was to be ambassadors of adventure and stewards of the trail, and that's kind of like, that kind of happened naturally. It was like we never expected to inspire anybody. We were just kind of out, planning a trip and doing something crazy, and then in the same way that was the history side. It wasn't like, I'm a history buff. The rest of the guys, they find it interesting, but it's not something they like dive into a lot. But it's one of those things where it's like you kind of become one when you're there, because you can hear about it when you're standing in the ruts where these people, walked. Because here's the big misconception is they rode over on wagons, right? Well, they didn't. They brought their gear over on wagons and they walked.
Yeah.
And if you look at the trail, it's now most of it's so overgrown you can't really tell what it was if you walked over it. But it's always two little, two divots in the earth, one for where the wagons went and one for where the people walked. And, when you're standing there and you're, in those ruts and you're in the heat of the day, it just brings a realism to it that, like, you can't not be a history buff at that point. You know what I mean? You're standing in something that you're like, this is crazy. I mean, we're doing this with, gasoline powered cars. They, essentially walked 2,500 miles across, like, and it was, a lot of it was like barren desert, it seemed like. I mean, like through Idaho and stuff. I mean, there's a couple times where I'm like, we are in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing here but dry grass. Like, this would be disconcerting to say the least if you're a pioneer and being like, well, where are we going to get water next?
Yeah. So and for you guys, how did you deal with resources? Were you dipping back in onto paved areas and heading into towns to stock up, or did you literally carry everything?
No, yeah, we stopped into towns to stock up, and that actually became a point of contention in the team because we didn't plan on moving so quickly, which means we burnt more fuel, which means we had to come into town to resupply a lot more. And so we're, where we thought we were going to be 3 to 4 or 5 days out before we'd have to come to town, we were like maybe 2 days out, and then we have to come back to town. So it was this thing where it's like, okay, we're always going back to town to get fuel. And, I would say I'd pretty much changed everything about the way we had our vehicles set up if we were to, for the next expedition. But it's just, you kind of plan the best you can. But yeah, we ended up coming into towns a lot to resupply. And it was a bittersweet thing because we'd end up in these towns and you'd get to have these interactions with these local people. One of the crazy things that happened, we ended up coming into, it's a little town in Idaho called Oakley, Idaho. I'd never even heard about it before. It's just a little tiny, imagine the population is probably less than 1,000. And we happened in town, and there's all these chairs like lined up around the sides of the street like there's going to be a parade or something. So we're like kind of rolling through, and we get our gas, and we're asking like, what's going on? And they go, oh, it's our Pioneer Day. And we're like, Pioneer Day? And he's like, yeah, once a year the town gets together and has this event, and they have a big rodeo, and they have this like parade, and it's their Pioneer Day. And I was like, that's so ironic because we're retracing the Oregon Trail. And like, well, we have a museum here and this and that and the other. And they're like, we're having this rodeo, and they're going to have this big fireworks show. And we kind of all looked at each other and we're like, well, why don't we just stick around for the festivities and see what it's all about? I mean, it's a Pioneer Day, right? It seems pretty suiting. And it was just kind of it was one of those situations where it felt like it was like old school hospitality. It's like this whole town like kind of brings you in, and we all had our shirts on, so we're identifiable, but it was like you're in this small town and all of a sudden people are coming up to you and talking, and and then we popped the rooftop tents and it was all over. I mean, there were people surrounding us and they were like, well, what is this? It's crazy, and then by the end of the night it was like we're sitting around a campfire with a group of people, and they'd cook this feast, and we're singing and around the campfire playing songs and carrying on. It was just like one of those situations where like I never expected to wake up in the morning and be here in Oakley, Idaho, watching a fireworks show with a bunch of people that I don't know. It's just one of those weird situations where it's like, that's what makes it all worth it, right? I mean, you get pissed off because you have to come into town more and more and more. But I mean, without coming into town, you wouldn't experience that kind of stuff. And I feel like that kind of community is what, that's why people do this. To see those communities, see something that's different from your normal life,
the everyday life. Yeah. And like there you mentioned one thing that you encountered, which you only encountered because of the way you were traveling overlanding. Were there other occasions? Did you have like major wildlife encounters, or were there times?
No, like nothing with a predator or anything, but we saw all kinds of stuff. I mean, the coolest thing is we chased a fox down the road for probably 2 miles. It just ran in front of our car. But I mean, we saw all kinds of. We went through Wyoming, and they have it's the most bizarre thing. And it was ironic because I was listening to this podcast, and they were talking about the area that we were in, and they ended up talking about these antelope that we were seeing. And these antelope in Wyoming are like 15 to 25 miles an hour faster than their closest predator. And so you're watching these things, and they don't necessarily always run away from you. They run alongside of you, and you're just watching these things cruise, and it's unnatural because of how fast they are in their environment. Like if you were to see it like in Africa and it's being chased by a lion, it's one thing. But when it's in North America and these things are cruising alongside of you and you're going, 35, 40 miles an hour and they're just pacing you, it was just a weird thing. And come to find out that the way those, there was in North America at some point in history, there was basically the North American Sahara, and they developed to outrun cats, but there's just not those cats there anymore. So that's like, it was weird because I'm like sitting there watching these thinking, those things are way faster than I've ever seen anything run in. Like, I mean, they're way faster than deer or elk or anything that we, see in North America. And I was like, that's just so weird that they're so much faster. And then here I am listening to this podcast a few hours later, and they're explaining why. It was weird. But yeah, I mean, there was tons of antelope in Wyoming. We saw deer and elk, and not a lot of predators. We went on a trip last year, that 10-day trip, and we heard there was a pack of wolves around us, which was kind of eerie. Made me glad I was in a roof tent, that's for sure.
Yeah,
but
certainly when they start howling and you can hear them calling, it's quite interesting.
We always talk about wolves too in our group, because it's like, I've seen bears, I've seen, cats, predators, just being out in the woods and stuff. And like, there's something about a wolf that's just creepy. It's like, I don't know what it is, the way they hunt or whatever, how smart they are. It's just like, when you hear that howl, you're like, that's really eerie. Kind of sends a chill down.
I think it's because the association with horror movies and werewolves, maybe.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. We grew up learning about werewolves.
Exactly. So, when you're travelling as well, you mentioned that you were stopping off at towns. How are you dealing with hygiene? 44 days, 4 guys in 2 trucks, sharing roof tents.
What's hygiene? We had a road shower, I guess. I put an onboard pump on my Land Cruiser.
Yeah. And
so, basically, one hose into the roto packs and one hose has a spray thing on it. And then we would try to stop every once in a while and pull through a campsite or something like that and shower off.
Have a proper shower, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I explained how close proximity you were. After a while, it's like, okay, we both stink. We're making each other miserable, so let's drop off and take a shower. But yeah, we tried to carry as much as we could with us. But another thing was, and this is a big learning experience for us, was just weight, because when you're doing a documentary and you have a team of 4 guys and you're doing what we do, you're carrying a lot more gear than a typical overlander would carry. And so the way we had the gear stored, like the balance of the weight, how much stuff we were bringing, all of that became a factor when you're out there for so long. And then you're fighting, fuel mileages, because I don't know what this is in metric, but it was 7,200 pounds is 72, and then 74 when you add another passenger is how heavy my Land Cruiser was. So it's it's pretty heavy.
Yeah. And
going down the road, it kills your fuel mileage, and it makes your the capability of the truck. Essentially we had that truck maxed out. I mean, that suspension, that truck was carrying as much as it could handle.
Yeah.
And still be able to
it's yeah, that's certainly one thing that I think people overlook. Initially when we set off on our trip, our car was seriously overloaded, and people make adjustments for it in the suspension, but it's also, you need to account for it on the cooling system,
right,
on the brakes. Like one problem we had was our car was so overloaded, when we did any kind of rock crawling, our brakes would just overheat and then just fail.
Yeah.
So you'd end up sitting, but again, you end up putting yourself in interesting situations. Like one time when we were in Morocco, we were up in the mountains real high, and we had a brake failure literally as we were coming into this little village, and as a result, we had to sit there for and let the brakes cool down for a good hour. As a result of that, we got invited in by the villagers and had an amazing breakfast. So
that's awesome.
There are always kind of plus sides, and I've said it a few times. I interviewed a guy who came out with the best quote, and he said, when things go wrong in the right kind of way. And that's just a perfect example of it. Something goes wrong.
That's a great saying.
Yeah, something will go wrong, but something good will seriously come out of it.
It's funny you say that, because there were so many times where we'd take a wrong turn, and then we'd end up at this situation where, like, if we hadn't done that, like, we wouldn't have been here, whether it's like a historical marker or coming into a town that you weren't planning on coming into. I think that's why we do it, right? I mean, it's the unexpected. I mean, we're the kind of people that don't like to know what's around the next corner. That's why we do what we do.
It's interesting you should say that. I just posted a blog yesterday, which was 10 things I've learned as an overlander, and one of them was expect the unexpected. And that's always the way. And certainly, just to go back to something else you said, all the best stories I have generally come out of times when either something has gone wrong or we've been lost.
Yep, totally. Totally. Yeah, that's why we do it, right? It's like, you know, the pursuit of the unknown. I mean, and it's crazy because, like, Oregon Trail Off-Road is, I would say, not in, like, the true vein of overland travel. I mean, we're very, like, you know, what is it? It's not about the pursuit of the destination. It's about, or it's not about the end goal. It's about the pursuit of the destination, right? That's like the kind of overlanding thing. And it's like, we very much, it's about the pursuit of the destination. I mean, we're trying to get from point A to point B in a certain amount of time and make it back, kind of a deal. So it's, you know, it's funny because it's like, there was a part of us that were like, we're doing this, we're calling it overland travel, but it's not really in that spirit, kind of, you know. And then we get to, I think this is the story where I was on before we cut out, but, you know, we got to Independence 8 days early, so we went down to the Ozarks in Arkansas. And it was like that was exactly what you're talking about. It was like, okay, we're here early, what do we do? Let's keep exploring, right? So we go down, and that was probably the best experience we had of the whole trip. I mean, it kind of capped off our trip. I mean, we put the trucks through the paces. I think we did like 8 or 9 river crossings. Probably 4 of them were pretty high. And I mean, the terrain there was, I've never been on that side of the country or in that area specifically, but it was very, very rainforesty. And it's always been something I'd wanted to do, is go to a rainforested area and overland in a rainforested area. And it was probably the closest I've been to that. Super humid, really like rainforesty. It was raining the whole time we were there. Yeah. So, you know, the rivers were inflated and everything, and the terrain was just, I mean, it reminded me a lot of Oregon, except for all the trees were different. It was a lot more humid and more rainforesty. Yeah. But that ended up being got there early, and it was one of those things where it was like, this ended up being the best experience we had on the trip, and it was not planned at all, you know?
Yeah. Like just then you mentioned the kind of landscape. Had you spent enough time in the great outdoors before the trip that the landscape wasn't a surprise? Because certainly for me, one thing that always blows me away, certainly, is some of the wilderness areas. Like we traveled through the Pamir Highway, and the landscape up there was nothing like I've seen anywhere else ever, and that just blew my mind. With the landscape you were traveling through on this trip, was it stuff typically that you had encountered before? Yeah, for the most part, until we came back. And then on our way back, part of our dilemma was we had to stay in the Independence area because my wife, Kobe's wife, and my kid and my parents met us over there, and they brought their fifth wheel, and then we were going to caravan back. And so we had to stick around in that area. And when we came back, we went through like Moab and the Canyon lands, Utah, Bryce Canyon, Colorado. And that was Colorado's a lot like we see. It's just everything's way bigger. The Canyon lands in Utah was like, well, actually, you know what? Let me step back from that, because Wyoming was kind of that same way too, where you felt like you were on a different planet. Like there was parts of Wyoming where we pulled in, and all that's there is like sandstone plateaus and these sandstone columns, and you're like out there, and aside from like this slight green vegetation on the ground, you could be on a different planet. And there was times where you're like definitely taken back by like, maybe I've seen pictures of stuff like this, but like when you're there, it just like, it's weird. You're like, this seems like what Mars would seem like. You know, when we were at the Canyon lands, it's like, yeah, this is like Mars. That's what it looks like. Yeah. And I think certainly having those experiences and encountering those landscapes, I think it gives you a new appreciation of the planet and just how awesome and massive and powerful everything is. And
it's amazing.
And I think it goes back to something I said earlier, that kids nowadays don't spend enough time in nature. I think if you spend more time in nature and you have an understanding of how the planet works, and then it gives you more context and appreciation of your own life, I think.
Absolutely. And it makes you it puts you in your place. It's hard to be prideful when you spend a lot of time out in nature.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's humbling. You kind of get a grip of the scale of the planet to some degree when you're in those
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. You know, our generation especially doesn't get out, and me included. I mean, here I am, 34 years old, and I'm just seeing this stuff that's in my backyard, and it's like, I mean, a lot of this stuff like you might see on pictures and stuff, but I mean, like everybody that travels says, like you can't ever get like the gravity of the situation from a photo. You know, when you're there and you're standing and looking at this stuff. I mean, waterfalls are my thing. I love waterfalls, and like there's been some waterfalls that you stand next to, and it's like you could feel it in your chest. It's, you know, so much power, and it's like there's nothing like standing there and feeling so small and something in front of something so, you know, beautiful and amazing. You know, it just kind of takes your breath away. Yeah. But yeah, our generation doesn't. I mean, like I said, I'm 35 years old and just now experiencing it, and I've spent a lot of time in the outdoors too. I mean, I grew up down in Southern Oregon, and all we did was, you know, play out in the woods. But it's like the planet is so diverse, and there's so much different kinds of beauty everywhere. It's just that's the thing that makes you want to keep traveling. And I think that's the addiction. Is like you start seeing this stuff, and you're like, well, how much more stuff is out there? What have I not seen? You know?
Yeah. The world's pretty big. There's a lot of it.
Yeah.
It's pretty nuts.
Yeah, it's too bad we just have one lifetime, right?
I know. It's just crazy. Like, we met this couple who were in their 80s, and they were in this massive truck, this really old, big European fire truck, big 4x4 thing, massive, and they had been traveling for the last 50 years. And
that's so crazy.
Oh man, they had matching tracksuits. They were like, they were just like completely
awesome.
Cool. And we ended up camping near them, and then we ended up staying for another couple of days, just because these guys had just the most incredible stories. And
I could only imagine.
And to think that some people spend, you know, 50 years of their lives constantly on the road is just absolutely insane. And there were still quite a lot of countries they hadn't been to. And you're just like...
Well, I mean, it's like you said, the world is a big place. I mean, you could spend, you know, so much time in one area. I mean, Oregon, that's my home state. I've been here for, you know, most of my life, and it's like there's still areas where I'm like, I didn't know this existed in Oregon, you know? So it's just so vast. Not enough time to explore it all, but... Yeah, 80 years, that's crazy. I couldn't imagine the stories. We ran into a guy. This was a crazy story. So we're in the backcountry of Ozarks, and we had just done this little tiny creek crossing. So we all stepped out of the truck, and we were talking and carrying on or whatever, and all of a sudden we hear this ATV, and we're in the middle of nowhere. And we're like, what the heck is this? So all of a sudden this old guy pulls up, chainsaw on the front of his 4x4 ATV, rolls up. What are you guys doing? And we're like, what are you doing out here? He's like, oh yeah, well, you know, I own property out here. What are you guys doing? And we told him like, oh, we were chasing the Oregon Trail. We got done early. We're down here. And he's like, really? He's like, I've got an old Civil War homestead that I've restored. And I was like, oh, let's go check it out. So we asked him how old he was. He was like 83 years old. Here's this 83-year-old man cruising on this ATV through like rivers, and like, I mean, we followed him to his property, and it was like we were going through rivers and up like crazy hills. 83 years old, get there, show us this whole like homestead that he's restored. It was beautiful. I mean, it kind of in the same, you know, genre, but he's, you know, brought it back up, and we're talking to him, and he's going on, and his neighbor shows up, and he's like, yeah, somebody threw big rocks down in the well, so we lowered Bub Pearson was his name, old Bub Pearson. Oh, we lowered old Bub Pearson down into the well. Here we are thinking like this happened years ago or something, and it was like a couple weeks ago. So it's like an 83-year-old man like lowered into a well, and it's like, it was just crazy. I'm like, I hope I'm kicking like that at 83 years old. I mean, the story that guy must have is crazy.
I think it's a clear demonstration of the benefits of spending a lot of time outside.
Absolutely.
It's good for you. It's healthy stuff.
Yeah, it was funny because we come to find out that dude was like, he owned most of the forest and he was pretty well off, but he liked being out in the forest and rolling around on his ATV and talking to people.
Yeah. So when you were traveling as well, did you have any other kind of like dramas? Did you have any major breakdowns, or did everything go relatively smoothly?
Yeah, I mean, we had our, you know, little quirks here and there. I think we had a power steering hose blow on the Land Cruiser, and we're dealing with, it was just, I think a lot of it was just the shaking around, but the hubs on both vehicles we had to go through a few times, and Kobe's more than mine, but we had to rebuild his a few times. But I think it's just kind of the terrain you're going through, and then, I mean, you're taking, you know, a Land Cruiser's a little bit more set up for it, but a Ford Ranger's not really designed for that kind of travel, so it's hard on the vehicles. But, you know, Chris did a good job. I mean, he basically was underneath those trucks every night, and we kind of needed one person to kind of go through the vehicles. That way you can kind of, it's like you said, you know, I mean, stuff starts shaking loose, and if you're not the one looking at it, you're not going to know if something dropped out. So we were really like, I mean, that's what happened last time. We had a major breakdown. But it was just from the shaking, right? There's at the bottom of the steering arm, where the steering arm connects to my hub on my passenger side tire. 2 of the studs had just shaken itself loose. So we went back to town, put a couple of bolts in there, and then we had to limp it for a few days till we could get to a town that had the parts. So we go into town, pick up the parts, and since we're doing this video, we're like, well, should we change them here in the parking lot, or should we do it on the trail? You know, it might be more appealing if we do it on the trail. So we're like, okay, then let's do it on the trail. It's kind of our famous last words, but you don't know what to expect, right? It's all a trail that we haven't been to, and we hit like one of the gnarliest trails we'd hit in Idaho. So, and not even thinking about the fact that we have just these 2 bolts put up in these holes, we're like, okay, well, let's go to, start trudging to the top. Well, I get to the top, and then Kobe's behind me, and he gets stuck right before the crest. And he's like, you're going to need to winch me out of here. I can't make it up. And I was like, okay. So I go to turn my truck around. I was like, well, that felt really weird. So I kind of go down the hill a little bit and turn a little bit more. And I was like, there's something not right. So I get out of the truck and walk around. The driver's side tires, the top of the driver's side tire is like pushed into the wheel well. And basically all 4 of those bolts now had fallen out. The 2 studs that were in there had fallen out, and the bolts that I put in sheared off. And so that tire was just wobbling there. And so we're on the top of this gnarly hill in Idaho. Nobody's coming to get you, right? And I'm like, okay, well, I guess this is what it's all about. We either got to figure out how to put this thing back together enough to limp it back to a town, or we leave it up here and go get the parts and have to come back up here and fix it. So we're like, what are we going to do? And, we had the parts, the studs that we needed. So we put 2 studs in there. Everything was just hammered, right? I mean, everything was bent and mangled and stuff. And so we kind of put it all back together and got it limped back to town. But of course it was a Saturday in Boise, Idaho, and we're trying to find, the parts for this thing. And one of the main parts we were looking for was a trunnion bearing for the hub. Of course, you can't find it anywhere. So like just by chance, this is the craziest thing. We walk into a junkyard, and I'm like, every single Land Cruiser I've ever seen in a junkyard, the axles are gone, right? It's straight axle. It's not IFS. It's always gone. So I'm like, I'm not even holding my breath for this one. I'm like, it's not there. We're just going to go look anyways, right? So we walk out to this junkyard, and in all of that, that area, there was, I think, maybe 1 or 2 of these Land Cruisers. So we walk in, and I see the Land Cruiser sitting there, of course, without the axle, and I'm like, okay, well, let's get out of here. And Troy, who was with me at the time, he was like, well, let's just go look. I'm like, the axles are gone. What's there to look at? He's like, let's just go look. So we walk up there and see some parts laying on the ground, and I'm walking up, and I was like, no way. There's 2 trunnion bearings sitting in the dirt right there. So we went and picked up the trunnion bearings, and I don't even think the junkyard charged me for them, but back on the road and got it fixed. But that was probably the craziest trail fix. There's those experiences where you're like, well, here we are. What are we going to do now,
Yeah. And in those situations when things do go wrong, how do your team react? Because I've certainly been in situations like that where I've really been quite stressed, and my wife has been relatively calm. And there's been other situations where my wife has been quite stressed, and I've been relatively calm. So how do the guys in your team deal with it?
That's about how it goes. It seems like whoever's driving the vehicle is the one that's most stressed out.
Yeah.
At the time I was driving it, so there's like moments where I'm like, I mean, you look at it and like you're trying to like wrap your brain around what's going on. You're like, okay, let's look to see what's going on. And there's that panic moment where you're like, this isn't like I'm broken down on the side of the road. This is like I'm broken down in the middle of nowhere, way out in the middle of like nothing. So it's a little bit different situation, but like with you and your wife and most kind of relationships and groups and stuff, I mean, there's always somebody to kind of bring everybody back to baseline and make sure nobody's freaking out. And I think it's even a little easier with a group of guys too, because typically there's one guy freaking out and everybody else is just trying to assess the situation and figure it all out. And it's those situations that you really see the group kind of shine. I mean, everybody get kind of pissed off and snippy with each other when everything's going okay, but when everything goes wrong, that's when kind of everybody bands together and you really see like why we put the team together the way we did.
Yeah, and I think to a certain degree as well, being a team of guys, I think it would be slightly less. I don't know what the word is. Kind of like light-hearted. Like I certainly know if I was traveling with my 4 friends, the dynamic would be completely different, and there would be a lot of, well, in English we call it piss taking, where you're kind of mocking each other and having a laugh, and kind of ripping each other.
Yep, exactly. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? I mean, Wilkie was the videographer, and this is the bad part. Is like for some reason, and it's just because of his personality, he's the easiest one. He was always the butt of everybody's like pranks and jokes. But being the cameraman, it never got caught on video, right? So we have all these great stories, nothing caught on video. But it was, there was kind of a point where I just felt bad because we were like, he's chronically losing things, and we would start like moving things around on him to mess with him. And after a while, we're like, we need to stop doing this. We're gonna drive this poor guy crazy. But yeah, it's a different dynamic when you have 4 guys. There's a lot of that banter back and forth and messing around and more pranks and just kind of being dudes, I guess.
Yeah, that's kind of nice though. Different dynamic. It was that was one of the other reasons why I really wanted to speak to you guys, because typically most of the people I've spoken to were either couples or families or kind of like lone riders, people who've been doing motorbike trips on their own.
Right.
So I think it was interesting just to talk about that different dynamic.
It is different. But I mean, I've traveled with my wife a lot, just here in the States and stuff, and it's definitely a different dynamic traveling with a bunch of guys. And there's pros and cons to both of them too, right? I mean, it's nice traveling with your, significant other and your family and being around all that. But there's a certain amount of like, when you're doing that, especially as being the dude, you kind of feel responsible for everything. You know what I mean? You're watching over your family, you're making sure everything's working the way it should. And with a group of guys, there's other dudes to shoulder some of that burden, I guess, if you want to call it that. Yeah. So it's there's pros and cons to both, but it's definitely a different dynamic traveling with a bunch of guys than it is your spouse or whatever.
Yeah. So what does the future hold then? So you were talking about possibly doing another trip in 2017.
2000.
And also what's your kind of goal with all the film stuff?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of stuff happening. We're kind of in that lull after we got back from the trip, and there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes. But we'll be coming out with a new website. We're retiring the Ranger, and we're going to do a different vehicle, so we'll have a reveal on that. The episodes for this trip that we just took, I'm shooting for February. I'm actually trying to get it done sooner. I do all the editing, so there's a lot of footage to go through. So we're trying to muddle through all that and get that out by late winter. And then, like I said before, we're doing the Outlaw Trail. So 2017, 2018, we'll be putting that together. It's just, we just got back, so we're still trying to, figure out the whole plan and all that. But this is kind of the fun part for me. That's where I shine, is behind the scenes, and it's kind of cool trying to figure out what we're going to do next and where we're going. And like I said, this was never in the plan. I mean, the plan was to go to Moab for 10 days with a bunch of friends. And, here I am sitting a few years later, like, how did this happen? But, it definitely morphed into something that was, even the history side of it was something that, like, I didn't intend on continuing on this path. But, when we saw this history and all this cool stuff that we were seeing, it was, almost like, how could we not? I mean, we're seeing so much cool stuff and talking to so many cool people and seeing this history, and it just, it was kind of a natural thing. So I think we'll probably continue on doing the historical trails, at least for the next 2 or 3 trips. And then we're hoping, I don't know, I always thought it would be cool to do the Continental Divide from Guatemala to Alaska. But
yeah,
so
that's cool.
But that's kind of what's on the horizon. I mean, for a while we'll be doing this historical thing and chasing that. And we'll probably always do the videos, as long as people are watching and enjoying it.
And if people want to watch the videos, do you have a YouTube channel?
The website. Yeah, we have a YouTube channel. Website's probably the easiest, OregonTrailOffroad.com. We got a website up now. The new one will be out in December, but you can hop on there and see all. We've got about 14 episodes, and that's all the planning and the practice trips, all the stories I've been telling about breaking down and stuff. You can watch all that on those episodes. And, we're just doing it, having fun. Like I said, none of us are professionals at this. We just kind of do it as a hobby and, try to do the best we can in it. And it's a lifestyle that we are fell in love with, and I don't see us changing that anytime soon.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, well, anyway, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you. This has been very enjoyable.
And I look forward to seeing what you guys do next.
Absolutely.
It's going to be very good.
Maybe we can get together and talk before we leave for our next one.
Yeah, definitely. We can sort that out for sure. Cool.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
was great to chat to Jason about a trip that had a real goal in the true sense of a traditional expedition. The diversity of the people I speak to is really representational of the variety of overland trips that are currently happening. If you like this episode, please take the time to listen to past episodes. I guarantee you won't be disappointed. I'm eternally thankful to be able to host this podcast and be in a position where I can share the stories of other overlanders, so thank you for listening. You can subscribe to our show on iTunes and Stitcher, both for free, by searching the Overlanding Podcast. You can also check out our website, theoverlandingpodcast.com. On there you'll find supporting information, videos, photos and links for this and every other podcast we've released. We love to engage with our listeners, so please find us on Facebook /The Overlanding Podcast and on Twitter @Overland Podcast. We're incredibly passionate about getting these stories out there, so please share our posts on social media. You can also support the show just by listening and telling other people about it around the campfire. If you're an overlander yourself and have an interesting story, we'd love to hear from you. We'd especially like to hear from people that undertook overland trips in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Okay, between now and our next episode, I want you all to go outside and check your tyre pressures. Bye.